I'd like to introduce our first keynote speaker, Dr. Bob Lackey. Dr. Lackey is professor of fisheries science at Oregon State University. In 2008, he retired after 27 years with the Environmental Protection Agency's National Research Laboratory in Corvallis, where he served as deputy director among other senior science and management jobs. He's published over 100 articles in scientific journals and is best known for his work at the interface of science and policy. Some of you may have heard Dr. Lackey present at one of the APB conferences many years ago. Dr. Lackey is originally from Kamloops, and it's great to welcome him back to BC. Dr. Lackey.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be back here and talk to this group, or at least a similar type group to what it was 5 years ago. I was asked to present something interesting, somewhat entertaining, maybe some substance to it, and so I sent in something scholarly. And a person whose name will not be mentioned, and I told Rebecca I wouldn't mention her, said, you got to give us something a little more controversial, something that will try to elicit some response to these people. And I said, well, how about something like this title? Basically, their work is marginally relevant in the real world. And her comment, I remember very clearly, was, you want to be lynched? I said, I am also a Canadian citizen. I will request that you convey to me, a dual citizen, the same respect you would anybody else. And do not lynch me until you at least hear my words. So let's start. What do I mean by policy? A word that really has lots of meanings to lots of different people. Those of us who are scientists, and I put myself in that category, would say, well, that's something I really don't want to do it. Oftentimes, those are the kind of people who pay the bills, so I have to deal with them, but I'd rather not deal with it. But these are examples of the kinds of policy questions that I'm talking about. They're not the specific regulatory, apply SARA or apply ESA or some typical types of legislation which tend to have lots of rules and procedures, and you kind of grind through and out pops an answer. Maybe a terrible answer, but an answer pops out. I'm talking about the more general questions, where we're trying to identify, the public's trying to identify through legislation or voting or whatever, something they want done. And they're not exactly sure what it is or how to do it, but they want something done. So when I talk about policy, these are the examples of the kinds of issues I'm talking about. Well, let's go back a long time ago, maybe your high school science class, if you can remember back that far, because I cannot. What is science? Science is a very precise type of information. It's information that's rational, that is, it does not rely on divine revelation, somebody else, some oracle saying something is true and you accept it. It's also systematic, that is, it follows a logical path that you can describe, and it's also testable. You can actually answer the question. If I walk outside and say, the weather is 70 degrees, you can go out and test it and see if I'm crazy or not. If I walk outside and say, the weather's great, you don't really have a clue what that means because that's not a testable hypothesis. And it's reproducible. Your colleagues, should they ever do it, could repeat your methods and should verify your answer, and if it's not right, you got to do more work. It's one type of information, also categorized as a scientific method. Only been around for 400 years, very commonly used in the West, and lots of people don't trust it. From a policy perspective, now I'm shifting gears here, going back to the policy side, it is only one type of information, one type of many, and certainly several common types, and political scientists will say it's not even the most important type. Science describes the way the world is, reality as it is, not the way it ought to be, not the way it should be, not the way you'd prefer it to be, not the way I would prefer it to be. It is what it is. That's all science is. A very narrow set of types of information, but arguably a very important one in certain situations. Now, an important point from philosophy, old news for those of you who can remember back to Philosophy 101, science is not value-free. Science is not value-free. We decide what we're going to research. Usually somebody gives us a grant or a contract to do it. Nothing wrong with that. but somebody has selected what's important. You have a certain expertise. You know, if you're a modeler, you see the world as modeling. If you're a biologist, you see it, say an embryologist, you see it as an embryological problem. If you're a geneticist, it's a genetics problem. So it's not value-free, but it is presumed that it's policy neutral. A very big distinction. Not value-free, but assumed to be policy neutral. But to be helpful in policymaking, it's a self-evident truth that scientists themselves have to be trusted. I mean, no one really understands the science, and we shouldn't be delusional to think they're ever going to understand the science, except for wildlife, where everybody is an expert. But exclusive of that, and also that's true about salmon. My barber is convinced, even though I've studied salmon for many years, he's convinced absolutely that everybody in the government agencies and anybody else about salmon know next to nothing, and they're just a menace. But he knows the revealed truth. Except for salmon and wildlife, conceivably, people take us on trust. But are scientists trusted these days? Now here's a hypothesis. The view of science is similar among the public in the US and Canada. Now I always say that that's a safe bet because my experience, and I come to Canada a lot, is that it's actually very lower here than it is in the States. But let's look at it. Trust in science. And by presumption, trust in scientists, and by presumption, science itself. Here's a question. These are very hard to get in polling data. Done several years ago, national polling data, randomly selected sample. It's only US, but I suspect it applies to Canada. Basically to the public, do you trust what these people in environmental science are saying? Now, most of you are scientists, so you're immediately saying, well, you didn't find what environmental science is, you didn't say what trust is, but this will give you a sense of what the public's thinking. The answer, 4 in 10, 40%, say they have little or no trust in what environmental scientists say about the environment. Now, that's kind of shocking to me. Maybe it shouldn't be, but it is. But here's the part that really is shocking. The other 60%, were not all that positive. They were kind of neutral to slightly positive. No one was effusive. So, in terms of trust out there, I think it's safe to say that we have a serious, those of us who are scientists, have a serious trust gap with the general public. Now, another interesting thing, in the circles that I travel in, which is pretty much folks like you, the assumption is that distrust comes from the political right. Well, the polling data show that the greatest distrust in science comes from, what's the example case study with the greatest difference between what scientists say and what the public thinks? What's that area? No, most people think it's climate change. It's GMOs. Greatest difference. And almost the distrust in science and the GMO policy debate comes from the left. Distrust from science and the climate comes from the right. Distrust from science in childhood vaccinations comes from the left. Distrust in science for fluoridation of water comes from the left. So you can make the case that it's both the left and the right. And arguably, although I don't have firm data, you could say it's slightly greater on the left side than the right side. So, as scientists, my take-home message is, where are our friends? Maybe it's the third party. But also, this works on the science side of the debate. I do some workshops for state agencies and some advocacy groups, usually environmental advocacy groups, and scientists in those groups are incredibly frustrated, and I suspect some of you are. And this quote, not exactly a quote, but it's close to what the guy said. Basically, he says, I do great science. I'm trying to be policy neutral. I'm very cautious. I follow all the rules. And once I throw it out there, everybody grabs it and uses and abuses it how they see fit to advance their case. No one trusts us. I'm not even sure that we're doing any good. Something's wrong. It ain't working. Something is wrong. Well, I'm here having spent the last 15 years as an adjunct in political science and say I have gotten an education which I was sorely deprived of in my previous time. And I don't want any of you to go back and say, Lackey learned something from the political science people. I wouldn't give them the satisfaction because I think they're a lot of strange folks, but I did learn something from them. I mean, their thought process, some of the questions they deal with just amaze me, but they've got some really good insights. One of the insights I've picked up in the last dozen or 15 years is to keep in mind policy reality. Simple stuff. People have been around for a while, been through some battles, some practical experience in agencies and other organizations, are well aware of this. But they really encapsulated a few key realities that are important. So, the first policy reality I always go back to time and time again when I get stuck in one of these firefights is to accept and acknowledge a simple fact that a political scientist would say, it's self-evident, don't you people all know this? I don't want to say that no, we don't know it. Not only don't we know it, most of us never heard it. And that is science. Science is not the key to resolving ecological or environmental policy disputes. We usually think it is. If you go back to your political science 101, if you go back and find your textbook, your notes, you can find these kinds of things in there. But I took political science 101. I don't remember this. Maybe I was asleep at the time or worrying about how the football team was going to do or something. But I just never jumped out at me. Science is not the key. Okay, that's a hard pill to swallow for scientists. I want to do a case study. Now, I was very sure that I was going to select a case study that no one here would be working on. This would be a case study that, I could go in and talk about the technical details and no one's going to challenge me. First thing last night, I'm talking to people over a beer. She's working on wind power. And then you heard examples this morning in the Northeast about wind power. So anyway, so much for that plan. But I want to talk about the Cape Wind Project. This is a very famous U.S. project off Nantucket, Cape Cod, Massachusetts, and it was developed or proposed about 12 years ago by the governments of Massachusetts and the federal government and a lot of regional groups. And the idea was to be a major, massive project off the coast to generate, and it's a great wind place. I mean, they don't call it Cape Wind for nothing. So it was an ideal location, close to population centers. So I want to use this purely to develop an idea for the assertion I made about science does not drive policy. Just for those of you who aren't familiar with wind power, this is not your little house on the prairie wind farm or windmill. These are serious construction projects. These are very large. The wingspan of these blades is the wingspan of a 747. The projects themselves cover a lot of real estate, but the transmission lines to get the power to the grid oftentimes is more controversial than the project itself. And they have some other nasty side effects from some advocacy groups. They kill a lot of bats. Some of those bats are listed at least under ESA and maybe under SARA too. Also some birds, some are protected under ESA and others are protected under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. So like all projects, they have some side effects that people wish they didn't have, but they do. That's all the science you need to know. Now we're going to move on to policy. The kinds of questions that are important here. How many should be built? It might be none or a lot. Those are the kind of questions that policy people have to answer. Where are they going to be built? That also has to be answered. And there's a whole series of other kinds of questions that need to be addressed. Well, in a democracy, underline democracy because a lot of us in science and engineering kind of forget that it is a democracy, as scary as that is. But it is a democracy. How are such questions answered? If you ask scientists, they're going to say basically you follow the linear model. No scientist will say follow the linear model, but that's what they will describe. And I was the same way when I was early in my career. This is the way it operates. And let's look at this great linear model. Political scientists will call it a linear model. Scientists, us, provide information to decision makers, policy makers, usually in government, and out pops an answer. And we may have some differences in the science, but we argue that amongst ourselves, and we come to a consensus, do a few reports, maybe get the National Academy, or several national academies do reports on it. We come up with a consensus on the science. The politicians, the senior bureaucrats grind through it and come up with an answer. Great, fabulous, linear model. It's a good, great, simple model. One problem. It's also called information deficit because if we have a problem, it's usually lack of science. So let's do more science, clarify the questions, and then the answer will be more obvious. But is it accurate? And the answer is no. Sometimes it's packaged under the guise of science-based policymaking. Tell me out here, is there anybody here that's against science-based policymaking? I have never found anybody. My impression is when that kind of a term is used in advocacy or description, it means your policy preference is not science-based, but mine is. Yours is clearly not, because you're using junk science. I'm using good science. My interest is in the public interest. You are a special interest. So when you hear those kinds of terms, they are essentially, in my experience in these kind of issues, advocacy terms. Here's the sad truth. The linear model does not work in a democracy. At least it hasn't worked for as long as I can remember. Disabuse yourself of this model. Put it to bed. It's not the way the world works except for the most simple problems. Well, how do scientists, folks like me, react when they first learn this, when they first see this in practice? A shock. I do some workshops for agencies, and this would be the kind of a quote you would get. People saying basically, those lousy politicians, I don't know what's with them. There must be Neanderthals. If they just understood the science, the best policy choice would be obvious. There must be a conspiracy theory here. Or they take a different tactic and say, and this is partially true, like most things, the public is scientifically illiterate, also largely true, and therefore the experts ought to make the decision. Democracy is a scary thing. Everybody's vote counts the same. So if you leave with one message today, the linear model or the information deficit model is not the way the world operates. And if you're a new biologist just getting involved in a process, you are heading for some serious, serious disappointment and disillusionment if you go through your working life with this worldview. Well, let's consider the reality how things do work. And the do work part goes through politics. And politics, as the old saying goes, is like sausage. Perhaps it tastes great, but you do not want to go there and see how it's made. And politics has somewhat of a similar flavor. When I teach a graduate policy class, and when I ask people, how many have a good feeling about politics? All the natural resource, all the environmental, all the ecological people, no way. The political science students, of which I get a few, yeah, that's really pretty interesting. That's kind of exciting. Invariably, people in our fields, at least my fields, have a negative to highly negative view of the political process. Well, let's go back to the Cape Wind Project and deconstruct it, which is what we do in the class, policy analysis, and try to get a flavor for what the real issues are and where science fits in. Now, with the Cape Wind Project and all policy projects, this is just the example, we have advocates in favor, obvious, and advocates against. The first take-home message is they're not just two sides. There are going to be many sides. So let's deconstruct and tease out those sides. If we dig just a little deeper, and not very deep, we see that we've got climate advocates. Wind projects are great. Cape Wind is fabulous. We ought to do it. Let's get to it. In fact, we ought to do more. But then again, we have others. Not in my backyard crowd. Senator Kennedy, the late Senator Kennedy lived there, and he, in so many words, he doesn't want to get up in the morning on his back deck and look out there and see a wind farm. Now, he didn't couch his arguments that way, and NIMBYs don't usually couch arguments that way. They couch it in other ways. But the point is, if you go below the surface, the argument is essentially, I don't want it here. Maybe a great idea, but in your backyard, not mine. It's a classic issue of wind farms in the Midwest. My wind farm, which I'm getting windmill, which I'm getting $5,000 a month for in my backyard, is a thing of beauty. My neighbor's windmill, which I get not one dime for, is an eyesore. And then we have other groups, like the Audubon. And I don't mean to pick on Audubon, because some of my best friends are Audubon, Sierra Club, all the environmental advocacy groups. But Audubon would say, yeah, it might be a good idea, but it kills too many bats. Well, not bats necessarily. Too many birds. There's other groups that be favor of bats. Too many birds and it ought to be elsewhere, and certainly not here. And there's plenty of other groups, advocacy groups of this type. That's just ones that I highlighted. Then we have the American Wind Energy Association. If this was in Canada, it would be the Canadian Wind Energy Association. These are the corporate groups that they either build the equipment, they install it, somehow they have a vested interest. And these are not mom and pop operations. These are large conglomerates, international groups. So you're dealing with some heavy hitters here in these advocacy groups, these industrial groups. Then we have the solar advocates. A very interesting advocacy group in wind power. Now on the surface you might say, in a perfect world we all hold hands and sing kumbaya. And the solar advocates would say, yeah, it's a good idea, but you know our power is a lot cheaper, and we can build it quicker. Doesn't kill any birds, at least the rooftops don't kill any birds. And we're really supportive of these wind people, but really solar power is better. Then you have fishing advocates and a whole bunch of others of this type. Fishermen groups in the Cape Wind would say, we fished here for 250 years, and there's no way we can weave through these windmills and catch any fish. They got cables on the ground, underwater, we're going to hook them. Who knows what the problem is? It's a great idea, just not here. Then we have, students picked up on this one when we first started to deconstruct this project, we have some unpredictables. When we first started doing the deconstruction of this case study, students kept coming in and saying, you know, people always refer to the Peacock network, the NBC, National Broadcasting Company, as the windmill network. Gee, why is that? So students started digging a little bit deeper and said, why do they call it the windmill network, you know? And, you know, not being skeptical, but trying to follow the logic path here, follow the money, it turned out that NBC was owned by General Electric. And General Electric happens to be the world's second largest manufacturer of turbines, okay, and some solar stuff too. And so it's not entirely surprising. And if I was General Electric and I owned a television network, MSNBC and NBC, I'd probably be pitching my products too. So a lot of the news coverage had soft coverage of wind farms. Aren't these beautiful? These are fabulous. It's going to be great. Now, who knows if this is the reason, but NBC or General Electric eventually sold NBC to Comcast. So now when you see issues of net neutrality on NBC, you might want to be a little suspect. And then we have the proverbial taxpayers. Taxpayers are not a monolith, but the way these wind energy, and solar for that matter, but particularly wind, operate is it's on tax credits or tax subsidies. Warren Buffett says he's a big investor in wind. He doesn't think wind's viable, but the tax credits are worth a lot of money. So the issue here is, how do you spend a taxpayer's money? Now, some fraction of taxpayers would say, this is fabulous. This is what government ought to do. They ought to invest in picking winners and losers. After all, we would not have built the transcontinental railroads in the U.S. if the government would have paid off the railroad companies to build them, because these were railroads to no place, maybe to California, but that was it, and that was a very small state at the time. And so we ought to be subsidizing these, and we'll pick winners and losers, and eventually it'll pay off. The counter argument is, of course, that's just corporate welfare. Let the market decide if these things are viable, let them build it. People don't put their private money in these things, and there's probably a reason. So that debate goes on. Then we have the health advocates. And it's hard to present this without being pejorative, but I'm not being pejorative, because if I opposed a wind farm because I couldn't stand looking at the things, or in my backyard, I would probably use a health argument. And so you have the windmill syndrome, which, you know, allegedly cause epilepsy because the cycling is so similar. And actually, if you listen to those wind things, they sound just like a tennis shoe in a dryer going round and around. And if you want to test this, put a dryer in your tennis shoe and run it 24/7 and see how long it is till you go crazy. You know, so, you know, it's hard to refute these things scientifically, and so that tends to delay the project. Then we have the proposers. Somebody's proposing to do this thing, usually a private organization in concert with a government organization, and so they're pushing it too, arguing in favor of the project. Then we have things that just, who knows where they come from in these debates, these policy debates. Radar users. Senator Kenney made the case, oh my God, you know, these wind farms off Nantucket are going to ruin the radar system, and our military plane is going to crash in the ocean. It's going to be the end of it. It's going to be national security's going out of tubes. We can't build it here. Well, you know, that took quite a few years. Military had to do a study, had to check these things out, see if it worked. And I think these days people think it's not likely to be a problem. And then we have just philosophical difference about the government's role. Government shouldn't be involved. End the story. Move on. That tends to come from the political right. And then in general, the political left tends to say, yeah, it's a perfect thing. Let's have a hybrid government. Let's have the government involved in these kinds of things like they are in utilities and some other activities. Then we have things that have nothing to do with the issue at hand, campaign payback. You voted for my favorite project when I wanted to get the government to pay for a big pier in my district last time, and I don't really understand your wind project, but if you want it, I owe you, okay? I mean, that's hard for analysts, rationalists like me to look at and say, that's not really how government works, is it? And then you have the most complicating thing, I think, and that is scientists for hire. All of us, including academia, including government agencies, are working for all these groups, or almost all these groups, providing science. And it's very confusing to the public, decision makers, or anybody else what kind of role people are playing. So let's go back and draw a few lessons from this simplified deconstruction of a wind project. First is that science is used by nearly every actor, nearly every player in the policy debate. Every group there, all the advocacy groups across the political spectrum will either have scientists on their staff or they'll hire scientists and they'll use science as part of their arguments. Science is an effective advocacy weapon in policy debates. How many people here decry use of negative campaign ads? Now, the only thing is we got half the people here are honest and the other half are too shy. And polling data shows that, like 75, 80% of the people say they can't stand negative campaign ads, but they're used and they continue to be used because they work. And a lot of folks decry the misuse of science in policy debates, but people continue to use science as an advocacy weapon because it works, it gets results. And as a user of science, and I'll be honest here, if you were just happen on a Cape Wind project and you're trying to figure out what's going on, or you had to vote on it and only have a hazy idea, who would you trust for science, to get science in this issue? Would it be government? Would it be the advocacy groups? Would it be the industrial consortiums? Would it be the opponents? I mean, that's a good question. I mean, who would you trust? So, a couple lessons from this first reality. Clashing values, that is, not science, are typically at the core of policy debates. A lot of times people are arguing about science, but really what they're arguing about is different values, different priorities. And arguments about science, and they can be very vicious and vitriolic. We see that in the GMO debate from the left, or the climate debate from the right. A lot of these arguments are fundamentally surrogate arguments over competing values. It takes a while to get past the rhetorical debate about science and get down to the core arguments. More science will not solve those clashes. Okay, that was the first reality. Science is not the key. Let's do a second reality. And the second reality is normative science has a corrosive effect on the whole scientific enterprise. Normative science has a corrosive effect on the entire scientific enterprise. Well, let's go back and refresh your memories. What is normative science? Normative science looks like science, sounds like science, presented by people who call themselves science, but it fundamentally is not real science or traditional science or regular science. It is science that has an embedded policy preference. Now, I would argue that you can do mission-directed research, you can study almost any topic you can think of, and do regular science without slipping into normative science. So let's talk a little bit more about this thing. How does traditional science become normative science? I would argue that it's incredibly easy to happen, and it happens often, more than we would like to admit. And I want to do a second case study to try to deconstruct it, and that deals with the California megadroughts. Great sounding term. Let's put this in a policy context. California, I think as you all know, Southwest in general, is undergoing some severe droughts, at least by recent historic standards. The droughts are as bad as they were in the 30s, and a lot of people think that they are as bad or will be as bad as the droughts of the 1500s. In the 1500s, for about a 100-year period, we had the so-called decadal droughts in California. People can reconstruct back about 2,000 years in California, the climate. We had the decadal droughts last maybe 10 years, and several of those in the 1500s, and they were pretty bad. But if you go back 1,000 years to the medieval warm period, when things were as warm as they are now, we had the so-called megadroughts. And the megadroughts were 100-year droughts. And these were very, very severe droughts. Some of the lakes in the Sierra Nevada were 300 feet below their current levels. You can see standing forests down there. Rivers stopped flowing completely. And while people don't know this for sure, it's very likely that salmon distribution was eliminated largely from California. You know, salmon distribution ebbs and flows depending on the climate, just like it's expanding in Alaska now as the glaciers recede. Salmon are moving up within almost immediately. And they also, if it got very, very hot and warm in California, they would contract northward. So no surprise there. But what do you do if we're going back to the droughts of the 1500s, much less the 1000? You just can't pack up and leave. So what they've done in California, last year, they passed Proposition 1. Proposition 1 is multi-billion dollars, and among other things, it's to look at the feasibility and fund building some storage impoundments. If you build storage impoundments, obviously, we all note this, especially if you go over the mountains here into the Okanagan, you can meter out the water, and by August, you'll still have enough water to get by if you're a snowpack-driven place like you are in BC and you are in the southern half of California. So let's look at that. The proposal is essentially to take a free-flowing river, put a dam on it to create a storage impoundment. Now, shock of shocks, the system on the left is very different than the system on the right. You know, salmon runs are not going to be helping the system on the right. And of course, conversely, you're going to get great largemouth bass populations and other fish are going to prosper on the right and not on the left. So that's the proposal. Now, let's play a little experiment here. For whatever reason, your organization, you personally or whatever, get a contract, get assigned, you get disgusted with the rainy weather, you say, I'm moving to Southern California, and you get on this team. And this team is multidisciplinary. If you're a fisheries person, that's what you do. Your soils, your hydrology, your wildlife, whatever it is. And your job is to assess the ecological consequences of building a dam on this river. You are a team member. Now, 3 years later, your team report's done, and your job is to present it to the public or decision makers. Now, your science is fabulous. There's no really room for debate, it's a complete consensus. If in your terminology in your presentation you use the term ecosystem degradation, have you moved into normative science? Yeah, you're waving your head. I can see people got the concept. Yeah, if you use the term degradation, you've implied the condition of the system on the left is better than the condition on the right. In other words, you will take as a given that a free-flowing river is superior to an impounded river. It's clearly different. Salmon will be worse off, but largemouth bass will be better off, and lots of other changes. But to say it's degraded has a built-in policy preference. Or you could take the exact same science, no difference, exact same science, and say ecosystem improvement. And what have you said? By impression, condition on the right is better. It will provide more flood control, better water in August, but it's the exact same science your last presentation said the system was degraded in. I would argue that's normative science. You cannot apply degraded or improvement without embedding a policy preference. Ecosystem alteration, to me, is the better term scientifically. It's clearly different. Yeah, it's not going to be the same. Lots of different changes, but it's neither better nor worse until you apply a policy preference. And political people, voters, legislators, bureaucrats make those decisions, not scientists. So in summary for this, I would say, yeah, terms like improvement and degradation are a clue. you've probably moved into normative science, and stick to words like alteration. Now, why is it that it's often difficult to detect? I think partly because we live in tribes, disciplinary tribes. I live in a world, trust me, this is the case, where probably 90% of the people would say it's degraded because they have a strong bias towards natural, pristine. And they would just look at that and say, the wilderness is really the best, and there it's all a step down. Okay? Now, if I went over to the College of Engineering and went to construction science, it would be the exact opposite. This is a built environment. This is an improved environment. Much, much better. We get rid of all the floods. We're going to have water in August. We're going to have maybe a little electricity production. This is vastly improved. Both tribal differences. So, what determines if a species is good or bad? That was an ecosystem. What determines if a species is good or bad? Let's do the same test. Here we have the honeybee. Now, we're all aware that honeybees are in relatively poor shape. You can argue what the cause is, but they're in relatively poor shape. An introduced species, and we feel sorry for them. We lament their state. I lament their state. I go to the garden these years. I never see any honeybees. They're gone. Here is the zebra mussel. They have a nasty habit of clogging piping and industrial things like that, but they do clarify water. But this is about the size of a dime. How many people here have a good feeling about zebra mussels? Nobody. My friend, the zebra mussels. Another introduced species, but we detest them. Here we have the wild horse, the Mustang. This is the icon of the West. How many people here have a good feeling for wild horses? Yeah, and how many people have a bad feeling? See, it's about equal, and a lot of shy people still. But this is another introduced species. And let me give you a clue here. And I don't know if they do this in the interior if they have wild horses. I assume they do. But anyway, in BC. But if you ever get a job with BLM or get offered a job with BLM to manage their wild horse program, do not take it. About half the population will say you're absolutely out of your mind. You go back to Canada. Don't even venture in this country again. The other half will say do more. I mean, this is you're trying to eradicate horses. You're crazy. So you just cannot win because the public is so polarized in this species. Take-home message: values determine whether a species is good or bad, not science or scientists. This is a policy, a political decision whether horses are good or bad, whether zebra mussels are good or bad, whether bees are good or bad. All introduced species. Lessons from reality 2. Advocates, and both individuals and groups, advocates often hide their advocacy in what appears to be policy-neutral science. It looks like science, sounds like science, but in fact, it's not. Whether you do it intentionally or not, the use of normative science, in my view, is in fact stealth policy advocacy. Because the average listener, the average reader, the average person you're presenting normative science to will never pick up on it. They can barely understand usually the simplest science that you present. They'll never pick up on the fact that what you're presenting in fact has an embedded policy preference, and you are stealthily arguing for your policy preference as a scientist. But being normative is okay sometimes. I admire policy advocates. Policy advocates have the best of all worlds. Other than don't lie, cheat, and steal, they don't have to follow any rules. If I was an advocate for any of these groups, I would use whatever science I could, use and abuse, selectively use it, because their job is to get their advocacy position adopted. I mean, that's perfectly reasonable. You should expect that. And I have a great deal of respect for policymakers because they have to take science and a whole bunch of other things and weigh the pros and cons, who wins, who loses, how to distribute benefits, who pays for it, who's going to lose on this deal. These are tough, tough decisions. The science part is the easy part. It's the trade-offs that's a difficulty. And of course, managers, which I was for a long time, who have to carry out these policies. We get abused by every side. So in fact, at least we ought to keep the science policy neutral. Let me wrap up with a take-home message, and it's free advice from the School of Hard Knocks that those of us who have been around for a while learned the hard way. I hope we've learned the hard way, but we've learned. And I think it's something that young scientists, new scientists, somebody just get involved, those of you who still are working in science fields, not in management fields or policy fields or advocacy fields with scientific credentials, but hardcore scientists, practicing scientists. If you're going to be involved, or might get involved, is think about these issues before you get thrown into a crisis. Being in front of the firing squad that debates is not the time to figure out the proper role of science in public policy. You're likely just to be struggling to survive, much less figure out precisely what the proper role is. Thank you very much.